Summer of 1945. The world, holding its breath, watches the final chords of the bloodiest war in human history. On May 8th, Nazi Germany capitulated, and Europe was finally freed from the Brown Plague. But in the Far East, the flames of war continued to rage with undiminished force. The Japanese Empire, despite serious defeats in the Pacific, still controlled vast territories in Asia and refused to acknowledge the inevitability of defeat. In Manchuria, on occupied Chinese lands, stood the million-strong Kwantung Army, the pride of the imperial armed forces. The Soviet Union, bound by a non-aggression pact with Japan, formally remained aloof from the Pacific theater of war. However, this fragile peace was deceptive. Relations between the countries had been marred for decades by territorial disputes and armed conflicts. The battles at Khalkhin Gol in '39 demonstrated the resolve and strength of the Red Army, but did not resolve the fundamental contradictions. At the Yalta Conference in February '45, Stalin promised the Allies to enter the war against Japan 2 to 3 months after Germany's capitulation. Now that moment was inexorably approaching. The Kwantung Army. This name instilled fear and respect even in battle-hardened Soviet commanders. By August 1945, it represented the most powerful military force concentrated in Manchuria, the puppet state of Manchukuo, created by the Japanese on occupied Chinese lands. The strength of this army comprised about 1 million soldiers and officers, organized into 31 infantry divisions, 9 brigades, 2 tank brigades, and a significant number of independent regiments and battalions. The Kwantung Army was armed with over 1,200 tanks, 5,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and about 2,000 combat aircraft. This was a true war machine, honed for prolonged defensive warfare. Over many years of occupation, the Japanese had created an impressive system of fortifications in Manchuria. Along the entire Soviet-Manchurian border, spanning over 4,500 kilometers, lay a network of 17 fortified regions. Each such region included dozens of reinforced concrete long-term firing points, connected by underground communications, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and wire entanglements. Especially powerful fortifications were created in the border regions of Primorye and Transbaikal, where the Japanese command anticipated the main thrusts of the Soviet forces. Nature itself aided the Japanese defenders. The mountain ranges of the Greater and Lesser Khingan, taiga masses, full-flowing rivers and swamps created natural obstacles for advancing troops. Japanese strategists believed that overcoming these natural barriers would require enormous effort and time from any adversary, allowing for the organization of effective defense. In the depths of Manchuria were large fortress cities, Harbin, Changchun, Mukden, transformed into powerful nodes of resistance. Their garrisons were prepared for prolonged defense, even under conditions of complete encirclement. The Kwantung Army was considered the elite of the Japanese armed forces. Its core consisted of career officers and soldiers who had undergone rigorous training and were raised in the spirit of unconditional loyalty to the emperor and readiness for self-sacrifice. The Bushido Code, the way of the warrior, demanded fighting to the last drop of blood and never surrendering. Many soldiers and officers had combat experience gained during battles in China and conflicts with Soviet forces at Khalkhin Gol and Lake Khasan. Despite Japan's serious defeats in the Pacific theater of operations, the morale of the Kwantung Army remained high. Japanese propaganda instilled in soldiers that they were defending not just occupied territory, but vital space for the Japanese nation, necessary for its prosperity. Even when the strategic situation for Japan became catastrophic, the Kwantung Army Command continued to prepare for a prolonged defense. Soldiers were ready to fight to the last, following the principle, better to die than surrender. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese command had carried out some reorganization of its forces in Manchuria. Some of the most experienced units were transferred to the Pacific Theater of Operations to confront American forces. Their place was taken by less prepared units, including reservists and recently mobilized. However, even with these changes, the Kwantung Army remained a formidable force, capable of offering serious resistance to any adversary. The Kwantung Army Command developed a defense plan designed for prolonged containment of the enemy. It was assumed that in the event of a Soviet offensive, Japanese troops would conduct stubborn defensive battles in the border fortified areas, gaining time to prepare a deeply echeloned defense. In case of an enemy breakthrough, a retreat to pre-prepared lines in the interior of the territory was planned, where prolonged resistance could be organized. In late spring of '45, when the red banner of victory already flew over the Reichstag, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command began a grandiose operation that remained hidden even from most Soviet generals. The transfer of colossal military forces from the Western Theater of Operations to the east of the country became one of the largest logistical operations in the history of wars. Endless echelons of troops, equipment, and ammunition moved along railways stretching for many thousands of kilometers. 11 combined arms armies, 3 tank armies, 3 air armies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and officers, with the experience of defeating the Wehrmacht behind them, were heading towards the borders of Manchuria. Marshal Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, who took command of Soviet troops in the Far East, understood. The success of the operation depended on the element of surprise. Japanese intelligence was not to suspect the preparation of such a large-scale offensive. For this purpose, an unprecedented system of disinformation and camouflage measures was developed. Railway trains with troops moved only at night, carefully camouflaging themselves in the forests during the day. Radio communication was conducted with the strictest secrecy measures, and to simulate the presence of troops in the West, radio stations continued to operate, creating the illusion that the armies were still in Europe. Commanders arrived in the Far East disguised as vacationers in civilian clothes, and enlisted personnel moved as construction battalions. The unloading of echelons was carried out only in the dark, and during the day all equipment was carefully camouflaged. To maintain secrecy, even high-ranking officers learned about the real plans only at the last moment. The General Staff, under Vasilevsky's leadership, developed a plan astonishing in its boldness. Instead of the attack along transport routes expected by the Japanese, Soviet troops were to deliver the main blows through the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountain range, which were considered impassable. The planning of the operation was complicated by the lack of accurate terrain maps. Many areas of the upcoming offensive were practically unexplored. To fill this gap, reconnaissance groups, operating under the guise of geological expeditions, were sent to border areas. Special attention was paid to studying Japanese fortifications. By early August '45, preparations entered the final phase. A grouping numbering 1,600,000 people, 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, about 26,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and more than 3,500 combat aircraft was concentrated on the borders with Manchuria. The Soviet command achieved almost a twofold superiority over the enemy, in manpower and overwhelming advantage in armored vehicles and aviation. At the same time, Japanese intelligence was able to identify only an insignificant part of these forces, believing that the USSR was not ready for large-scale actions in the Far East. On August 5, 1945, Vasilevsky reported to the Stavka on the full readiness of the troops for the offensive. 4 days later, the world would learn about the beginning of an operation that would go down in history as an example of a brilliantly planned and lightning-fast strategic campaign. To defeat the Kwantung Army, the Soviet command formed a powerful grouping consisting of 3 fronts, each of which represented an impressive military force. The Trans-Baikal Front, under the command of Marshal of the Soviet Union Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky, held positions on the western borders of Manchuria. Its composition included the 17th, 36th, 39th, and 53rd Combined Arms Armies, the 6th Guards Tank Army, the Soviet Mongolian Cavalry Mechanized Group, and the 12th Air Army. Malinovsky, who rose from a private in World War I to a marshal in World War II, was known as a decisive and proactive commander. His experience in leading troops in the Jassy-Kishinev operation and in the liberation of Hungary instilled confidence in the successful completion of the most difficult task of breaking through the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountain range. The First Far Eastern Front, commanded by Marshal of the Soviet Union Kirill Afanasyevich Meretskov, was located in Primoria. Its composition included the 1st Red Banner, 5th, 25th, and 35th Armies, the Chuguyev Operational Group, the 10th Mechanized Corps, and the 9th Air Army. Meretskov, who distinguished himself brilliantly in breaking the blockade of Leningrad and in the Vyborg operation, was a master of overcoming fortified defensive lines and conducting combat operations in complex forested terrain, precisely the conditions that awaited his troops in Primoria. The Second Far Eastern Front, under the command of Army General Maxim Alexeyevich Purkayev, held positions along the Amur River and in the northern part of Manchuria. Its composition included the 2nd Red Banner, 15th and 16th Armies, the 5th Separate Rifle Corps, the Kamchatka Defensive Region, and the 10th Air Army. Purkayev, who began the war as Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District, gained valuable experience commanding troops in the difficult conditions of Karelia. His calmness and methodical approach to planning operations were essential qualities for a commander whose troops were to cross the mighty Amur and overcome mountainous taiga terrain. All 3 commanders were professionals of the highest class, having passed the harsh school of war with Nazi Germany. They brought invaluable combat experience, accumulated on the Western fronts, to the Far East. Under their command were battle-hardened officers and soldiers, many of whom had several military awards. These people learned to fight in the most difficult conditions, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and find unconventional solutions in critical situations. The technical equipment of the Soviet troops was at the highest level. Tank armies were equipped with the latest T-34 tanks and heavy IS-2 tanks and self-propelled artillery units. Artillery, which earned the well-deserved title of God of War, included powerful howitzers, anti-tank guns, and Katyusha rocket launchers. Soviet aviation, represented by Yak-3 and La-7 fighters and Il-2 and P-2 bombers, ensured complete air superiority. The morale of the Soviet troops was high. The victory over Nazi Germany instilled confidence in the imminent end of the war with Japan. Many soldiers and officers remembered the perfidious actions of the Japanese at Lake Khasan and on the Khalkhin-Gol River, and were eager to finally eliminate the threat from the east. Among the personnel were many Far Easterners, for whom the upcoming battles meant protecting their homeland from a potential invasion. The total strength of the Soviet grouping was 1,600,000 people, which provided an almost twofold superiority over the enemy. In terms of tanks and self-propelled units, the superiority was five-fold, and in aviation, threefold. These forces were ready to unleash a powerful, coordinated strike on the Kwantung Army from three directions. The strategic design of the Soviet command for the Manchurian operation was a masterpiece of military art. At its core was the idea of delivering powerful converging blows with the aim of encircling and dismembering the Kwantung Army into isolated groups. This plan, developed by Marshal Vasilevsky and the General Staff, was striking in its audacity and innovation. Instead of striking along obvious transport arteries where the Japanese had established powerful fortified areas, the Soviet command decided to act where the enemy least expected it, across the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountain range. This approach fully corresponded to the principle formulated by Suvorov: strike the enemy not where he is strong, but where he is weak. The Trans-Baikal Front, under the command of Marshal Malinovsky, was to deliver the main blow from the territory of Mongolia across the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountain range into the central part of Manchuria. The 6th Guards Tank Army of General Kravchenko was tasked with rapidly overcoming the waterless expanses and mountain passes, breaking into operational space and cutting off enemy communications. The Japanese command considered this route impassable for large mechanized formations, which was intended to ensure the element of surprise. The first Far Eastern Front of Marshal Meretskov struck from Primoria, where the most powerful Japanese fortifications were located. Special assault groups, equipped with flamethrowers and explosives, were created to overcome them. Advanced detachments were to infiltrate through the junctions between fortified areas, bypassing the main strongholds of resistance and developing the offensive deep into the enemy's defenses. The Second Far Eastern Front of General Prokhayev was tasked with forcing the Amur and Ussuri rivers, overcoming the taiga massiva of Lesser Khingan, and developing an offensive to meet the troops of the Trans-Baikal Front, closing the encirclement around the main forces of the Kwantung Army. A special role was assigned to the Pacific Fleet and the Amur Flotilla. They were to land troops in key ports of North Korea and on Sakhalin, cutting off enemy sea communications. Air armies were tasked with gaining air superiority from the first hours of the operation, paralyzing the enemy's troop control system and disrupting his communications. A key element of the plan was the swiftness of action. The Soviet command understood that the Japanese were counting on a protracted campaign, during which they would be able to use the advantages of the terrain and pre-prepared defensive lines. To thwart these plans, the pace of the offensive had to be maximal. Tank and mechanized formations were ordered not to engage in protracted battles with individual strongholds, but to advance rapidly, leaving their blocking to subsequent echelons. To maintain high rates of advance, a unique logistical support system was created. Given the enormous distances and off-road conditions, special attention was paid to creating mobile stocks of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Special transport detachments were formed using high prohodimosti vehicles, capable of following directly behind the combat formations. To overcome the Khingan, tank units received additional fuel supplies and special equipment for movement on mountain roads. The element of surprise was considered decisive for the success of the entire operation. The Japanese command, despite the tense situation in the Pacific theater of operations, did not expect the USSR's rapid entry into the war. Even receiving intelligence about the concentration of Soviet troops near the borders, it tended to consider this as defensive measures or a show of force. To enhance the effect of surprise, the start of the offensive was set for the night of August 8 to 9, immediately after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, when the attention of the Japanese command was riveted to the threat from the sea and air. A feature of the plan was its flexibility. Vasilevsky understood that unforeseen circumstances would inevitably arise during the operation, and he granted the front commanders broad powers to make independent decisions within the framework of the general design. This allowed for prompt responses to changes in the situation without waiting for instructions from the center. The choice of the main directions of attack was the result of a thorough analysis of the enemy's defense system. Soviet intelligence managed to identify not only the location of fortified areas, but also the system of reserves, transport infrastructure, and the Japanese command's plans in case of war. This made it possible to identify the most vulnerable points in the Kwantung Army's defense and concentrate the main efforts there. The operation plan provided for deep penetration into the enemy's rear, the capture of key administrative and industrial centers, Harbin, Changchun, Mukden. For this purpose, special advanced detachments were created, which were to reach these cities at maximum speed, outstripping the retreating Japanese troops. Special attention was paid to the capture of bridges, tunnels, and other important infrastructure facilities to prevent their destruction by the retreating enemy. The night of August 8th to 9th, 1945. Heavy leaden clouds covered the star-filled sky over Manchuria. Torrential rain washed away roads, turning them into impassable mire. Nature seemed to be testing the resolve of the Soviet command. But at 1:30 a.m. Khabarovsk time, the silence was broken by the roar of engines and the clanking of tracks. The advanced detachments of 3 fronts simultaneously crossed the state border. The Manchurian operation had begun. In the zone of the Transbaikal front, the advanced battalions of the 6th Guards Tank Army moved first. Their task was to overcome the enemy's border outposts and clear a path for the main forces. The tank crews acted without artillery preparation, relying on the element of surprise. Japanese border guards, not expecting an attack, were literally swept away by the swift assault. By dawn, the advanced detachments had penetrated tens of kilometers deep into enemy territory. In the Three Rivers region, reconnaissance groups of General Pliev's cavalry mechanized group silently neutralized Japanese border posts and secured passage for the main forces. Mongolian cavalrymen, perfectly oriented in the arid steppe, served as guides for Soviet mechanized units. Columns of military equipment stretched for many kilometers, moving along pre-scouted routes through the Gobi Desert. In the direction of the First Far Eastern Front, special assault groups attacked the pillboxes of fortified areas. Sappers, under the cover of darkness, made passages through minefields and wire entanglements. Assault groups, armed with flamethrowers and explosives, destroyed enemy firing points. Simultaneously, advanced battalions infiltrated through gaps between fortifications, bypassing the main resistance nodes from the flanks and rear. The troops of the Second Far Eastern Front, under torrential rain, forced the Amur and Ussuri rivers. Sappers in rubber boats transported advanced groups who seized bridgeheads on the opposite bank. The main forces followed. The Japanese, not expecting an offensive in such unfavorable weather conditions, were unable to organize an effective defense of the river lines. The Pacific Fleet landed troops in the ports of North Korea, Yuki, Rasan, and Seishin. Marines under the command of General Trushin swiftly captured the ports, cutting off the Kwantung Army's sea communications. The Amur flotilla supported the crossing of troops across the rivers with fire and advanced in the wake of the assaulting units. Soviet aviation, despite the most difficult meteorological conditions, struck enemy command posts, airfields, and railway junctions. In the very first hours of the operation, key elements of the Kwantung Army's control system were disabled. Japanese aviation, caught off guard, suffered heavy losses at airfields and was unable to offer organized resistance. By midday on August 9th, the Japanese command realized the scale of the catastrophe. Commander-in-Chief of the Kwantung Army, General Yamada Otozo, received conflicting reports of the Soviet offensive from all directions. The communication system was intermittent. Many command posts were out of contact. Confusion reigned at headquarters. No one had expected such a swift and powerful blow. The Japanese command attempted to organize counterattacks with reserve forces, but the rapidly changing situation prevented adequate decisions. Reserve divisions, advancing to the border, came under attack from Soviet aviation and engaged in fragmented battles, failing to achieve their objectives. By the end of the first day of the operation, the troops of the Transbaikal Front had advanced up to 150 kilometers deep, overcoming border fortifications and reaching the foothills of the Greater Khingan. The First Far Eastern Front broke through the enemy's first line of defense to a depth of 25 kilometers. The troops of the Second Far Eastern Front seized bridgeheads on the right bank of the Amur and Ussuri, providing conditions for the development of the offensive. The Transbaikal Front, under the command of Marshal Malinovsky, faced a task that many military experts considered impossible. They had to overcome the Greater Khingan, a mountain range with peaks up to 2,500 meters high, dissected by deep gorges, with steep slopes and an almost complete absence of roads. The Japanese command was confident. Tank formations would not pass here. It was on this confidence that the daring plan of the Soviet command was built. The 6th Guards Tank Army, under Colonel General Kravchenko, became the main strike force in this direction. By the evening of August 9th, the advanced units of the army reached the foot of the ridge. Hundreds of kilometers of mountain trails lay ahead where heavy equipment had never passed before. The tankers were preparing for the most difficult stage of the operation. To overcome the Khingan, special advanced detachments were created, consisting of reinforced tank brigades with attached engineering units. Each tank carried additional barrels of fuel and a supply of provisions. The crews received precise instructions on overcoming steep ascents and descents. On August 10th, the incredible began. Columns of T-34 tanks and heavy IS-2 tanks moved into the mountains. The machines crawled up steep slopes, overcoming passes at altitudes of up to 1,500 meters. Engines worked at their limit. Tracks slipped on slippery sections. Driver mechanics displayed miracles of skill, maneuvering between rocks and precipices. In places, it was necessary to widen trails with explosions or build temporary bridges across gorges. Sappers went ahead, neutralizing mines and preparing passages. Tanks overcame ascents with a gradient of up to 30 degrees, which was considered technically impossible. Special driving techniques and mutual assistance of crews were used for this. When individual vehicles got stuck, they were pulled out with cables by other tanks or tractors. Mechanics worked around the clock, eliminating breakdowns directly on mountain trails. Providing the advancing troops with fuel was particularly difficult. Fuel consumption in mountain conditions far exceeded norms. To solve this problem, mobile refueling points were organized, which followed directly behind the combat formations. Fuel tankers, overcoming the same difficulties as the tanks, delivered fuel to the passes. In the most inaccessible places, pack animals were used to transport canisters of gasoline. The commander of the 6th Guards Tank Army, Colonel General Kravchenko, personally supervised the overcoming of the ridge, being in the combat formations of the advanced detachments. His presence inspired the tankers to seemingly impossible feats. The Japanese command received reports of Soviet tanks moving through the Khingan, but refused to believe it. According to their calculations, even if individual vehicles managed to overcome the passes, the bulk of the equipment would get stuck in the mountains. This miscalculation proved fatal. By the end of August 11th, the advanced units of the 6th Guards Tank Army had overcome the main ridge of the Greater Khingan. and began their descent to the Manchurian plain. Ahead lay operational spaces with a developed road network, where tank formations could fully realize their advantage in speed and maneuverability. The pace of advancement sharply increased. If, when overcoming the ridge, it was only 15 to 20 kilometers per day, then on the plain it increased to 70 to 80 kilometers. The mechanized formations of the Trans-Baikal Front rushed to the key cities of central Manchuria: Changchun, Mukden, Qiqihar. Japanese garrisons scattered throughout these cities were unprepared for such a rapid advance of Soviet troops. They expected the enemy to appear no earlier than 2 to 3 weeks after the start of the offensive. Now they had to hastily organize defenses, without a clear idea of the strength of the attackers and the directions of their strikes. Air landings played a special role in the successful overcoming of the Khingan. Small groups of paratroopers were dropped by helicopters onto passes and key road junctions, captured them, and held them until the main forces arrived. This allowed preventing the Japanese from organizing defenses on advantageous lines. Aviation provided invaluable support to the advancing troops. Despite difficult weather conditions and mountainous terrain, pilots made several combat sorties a day, attacking retreating enemy columns and suppressing pockets of resistance. Aerial reconnaissance provided the command with operational information about the movements of Japanese troops. By August 13th, the formations of the Trans-Baikal Front had completely overcome the Greater Khingan and launched a rapid offensive throughout central Manchuria. The Japanese defense was split into isolated pockets of resistance, between which huge gaps formed, into which Soviet tank and mechanized formations rushed. The Kwantung Army found itself in a critical situation. Its flanks were deeply enveloped, and its main communications were cut. The breakthrough through the Greater Khingan became a decisive factor in the success of the entire Manchurian operation. It allowed Soviet troops to get behind the main enemy grouping and create conditions for its complete encirclement. The Japanese command, which had planned a protracted defensive campaign with a gradual retreat to pre-prepared lines, was unprepared for such a rapid development of events. Their plans were completely destroyed by the daring maneuver of the Soviet troops. The overcoming of the Greater Khingan by the 6th Guards Tank Army went down in the history of military art as an example of a brilliantly planned and masterfully executed operation in the most difficult conditions of mountainous terrain. This feat of Soviet tankers became possible thanks to the highest skill of the crews, excellent technical preparation of the machines, and the bold operational design of the command. The operations of the 1st and 2nd Far Eastern fronts unfolded under conditions no less challenging than the offensive across the Greater Khingan. Marshal Merezkov's troops were tasked with breaking through the powerful Japanese fortification system in Primorye, which the Japanese had been building and improving for many years. This was a true Mannerheim line of the Far Eastern theater of operations: concrete pillboxes with multi-layered walls, underground galleries, minefields, and anti-tank ditches. The Japanese were confident in the impregnability of this defensive line. Merezkov, who had extensive experience in breaking through fortified lines in Finland, developed a detailed plan based on thorough reconnaissance and pinpoint strikes against the most vulnerable sections of the Japanese defense. Special groups were created for assaulting the fortifications, including sappers, flamethrower operators, and assault detachments. Each group received a specific task and detailed diagrams of the assigned objective. The offensive began without artillery preparation, which came as a complete surprise to the Japanese. Advanced detachments infiltrated through the gaps between fortified areas under the cover of night and attacked them from the rear and flanks. Simultaneously, assault groups attacked key pillboxes from the front. The Japanese garrisons, finding themselves under attack from multiple directions, could not organize a coordinated defense. By the end of the first day of the offensive, the troops of the First Far Eastern Front had broken through the first line of fortifications and advanced 10 to 15 kilometers deep into the enemy's defense. General Krylov's Fifth Army particularly distinguished itself, delivering the main blow in the Mudanjiang direction. Its advanced units, having overcome the fortified area, rushed towards the city of Mudanjiang, a key hub of Japanese defense. The troops of the Second Far Eastern Front, under the command of General Prakayev, operated under even more difficult conditions. They had to cross the full-flowing Amur and Ussuri rivers, and then overcome vast marshy areas and mountainous taiga terrain. Special landing detachments, equipped with light boats and rafts, were created for crossing the rivers. Under the cover of night, these detachments crossed to the opposite bank and seized bridgeheads, ensuring the crossing of the main forces. Engineering units quickly built pontoon bridges and ferry crossings. The Amur military flotilla provided fire support to the crossing troops, suppressing enemy firing points on the bank. Naval landings carried out by the Pacific Fleet in the ports of North Korea played a special role in the operations of the First and Second Far Eastern Fronts. The landing forces captured the ports of Yuki, Rasan, and Seishin, cutting off the sea communications of the Kwantung Army and creating a threat to its rear. This forced the Japanese command to withdraw some forces from the front to counter the landings, which eased the task for the advancing ground forces. The landing operation on southern Sakhalin began on August 13th. Troops of the 16th Army, supported by ships of the Pacific Fleet, landed on the coast and began advancing deep into the island. Japanese garrisons offered fierce resistance, but, deprived of support from the mainland, were doomed to defeat. The offensive of the First Far Eastern Front developed rapidly. After breaking through the fortified areas, the pace of advance sharply increased. Advanced mechanized units rushed towards key cities in North Korea and southern Manchuria. Japanese troops, having lost control and finding themselves semi-encircled, began to retreat to the central regions of Manchuria, where they hoped to link up with the main forces of the Kwantung Army. However, these plans were not destined to materialize. By August 15th, the troops of the First Far Eastern Front had broken into operational space and linked up with units of the Trans-Baikal Front, closing the encirclement around the main enemy forces. Thus, the operations of the First and Second Far Eastern Fronts, despite the extremely difficult terrain conditions and the powerful Japanese fortification system, were carried out with the highest skill and were crowned with complete success. They became a crucial component of the overall strategic design of the Manchurian operation, ensuring the encirclement and subsequent defeat of the Kwantung Army. While ground forces rapidly advanced deep into Manchuria, Soviet air and naval forces played an equally important role in the operation. Air superiority became one of the key factors, ensuring the swift success of the offensive. 3 air armies, the 9th, 10th, and 12th, comprised over 3,500 combat aircraft. From the very first hours of the operation, they delivered powerful strikes against Japanese airfields, command posts, and communication centers. Japanese aviation, caught by surprise, suffered heavy losses directly on the ground. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the runways before they could take off. Soviet Yak-3 and La-7 fighters reliably covered the advancing troops, preventing the enemy from conducting aerial reconnaissance and delivering bomb strikes. Il-2 attack aircraft, dubbed Black Death by the Japanese, continuously attacked columns of retreating troops, inflicting enormous damage. The actions of the aviation in destroying the enemy's transport infrastructure proved particularly effective. Railway bridges, tunnels, and stations were subjected to massive bombardments. This led to a complete paralysis of railway communication in Manchuria. The Japanese command lost the ability to rapidly transfer reserves and supply its troops. Combat zones became isolated from each other, which prevented the Kwantung Army from organizing coordinated resistance. Aerial reconnaissance provided the command with accurate information about enemy movements. Reconnaissance pilots in PE-2 aircraft made several sorties a day, photographing Japanese troop positions and retreat routes. This data was immediately transmitted to the headquarters of the advancing formations, allowing for prompt adjustments to operational plans. The Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Yumashev, decisively entered the struggle for naval supremacy. Its ships blockaded the coast of North Korea and South Sakhalin, cutting off Japanese garrisons from sea supply. Submarines actively operated on enemy sea lanes, sinking transports with troops and military cargo. The most impressive were the fleet's amphibious operations. In the very first days of the offensive, Marines landed in key North Korean ports, Yuki, Rashin, and Seishin. These landings, despite fierce resistance from Japanese garrisons, managed to capture and hold port infrastructure, creating bridgeheads for the advance of ground forces. On August 14th, the Kuril Islands landing operation began. Ships of the Pacific Fleet, under air cover, landed troops on Shumshu Island, the northernmost of the Kuril chain. The Japanese garrison offered fierce resistance. Battles for the island continued for several days and became some of the bloodiest during the entire Manchurian operation. However, by August 18th, enemy resistance was broken, and Soviet troops began to liberate the remaining islands of the Kuril chain. The Amur military flotilla played a crucial role in supporting ground forces on riverine directions. Its armored boats and monitors provided fire support during the forcing of the Amur and Ussuri rivers, suppressing enemy firing points on the banks. They then advanced behind the attacking troops along the rivers of Manchuria, landing tactical airborne assaults in the enemy's rear and disrupting its communications. The flotilla's actions on the Sungari River proved particularly effective. Armored boats with landing parties on board rapidly advanced towards Harbin, the most important industrial and transport center of Manchuria. The sudden appearance of Soviet ships caused panic in the city's Japanese garrison and contributed to its rapid surrender. The coordination of aviation, naval, and ground forces reached an unprecedented level during the Manchurian operation. Commanders of all branches of the armed forces acted according to a single plan, promptly reacting to changes in the situation and maintaining continuous communication. This allowed for the most effective use of the advantages of each branch of service and achieved a synergistic effect. The superiority of Soviet forces in the air and at sea played a decisive role in the rapid development of the operation. Deprived of air support and cut off from sea supply, the Kwantung Army found itself in a hopeless situation. Its command lost the ability to maneuver reserves and organize effective defense. Even in the boldest predictions, the Soviet command did not anticipate that the operation would develop so rapidly. But thanks to the effective actions of aviation and the fleet, as well as the heroism of the ground forces, within just a few days, goals were achieved that, according to preliminary calculations, would have required weeks. The success of air and naval operations in the Manchurian campaign was made possible by thorough preparation and the high professionalism of Soviet pilots and sailors. Many of them had extensive combat experience gained during the war with Germany. This experience, multiplied by excellent technical equipment and the boldness of the command, allowed for the rapid achievement of complete superiority over the enemy in the air and at sea. By mid-August 1945, Soviet troops, rapidly advancing deep into Manchuria, reached the approaches to the region's key administrative and industrial centers, Harbin, Changchun, and Mukden. These cities held not only strategic but also symbolic significance. Harbin, founded by Russian builders of the Chinese Eastern Railway, was the largest industrial hub and transport center. Changchun was the capital of the puppet state of Manchukuo, the residence of the last Chinese emperor Puyi. Mukden, Shenyang, was the ancient capital of Manchuria, a major industrial center with a developed military industry. The Japanese command intended to transform these cities into powerful strongholds of resistance, capable of holding back the Soviet offensive for an extended period. To this end, significant garrisons were concentrated there, and provisions and ammunition stockpiles were created. Special attention was paid to preparing for the destruction of industrial enterprises, bridges, power stations, and other vital facilities in the event of a retreat. The Soviet command, foreseeing such a scenario, developed special plans for capturing the cities with minimal destruction. For this purpose, advanced detachments were formed, consisting of tank and motorized rifle units with attached paratrooper groups. Their task was to swiftly reach the cities, outflanking retreating Japanese units, and seize key objectives before the enemy could destroy them. Airborne landings played a special role in these operations. Small groups of paratroopers were dropped by transport planes into areas of airfields, railway junctions, bridges, and power stations. Tasked with holding these objectives at all costs until the main forces arrived, they acted decisively and selflessly. The battle for Harbin became a model for such an operation. On August 14th, the advanced detachment of the 1st Far Eastern Front, under the command of Colonel Zabaluev, reached the outskirts of the city. Simultaneously, armored boats of the Amur flotilla, carrying marine landing parties, broke through to Harbin along the Sungari River. An airborne landing captured the airfield and railway station. The Japanese garrison, numbering around 20,000 soldiers and officers, found itself in disarray. The appearance of Soviet troops from several directions at once created the impression that the city was already surrounded by superior forces. A group of Soviet officers led by Major Zabaluev boldly entered the headquarters of the Japanese garrison and demanded surrender, stating that otherwise the city would be subjected to a massive bombardment. This was a bluff. The Soviet command at that moment lacked the real forces for an assault on the city, but the Japanese believed it. After brief hesitation, the garrison commander, Lieutenant General Hata, made the decision to surrender. 20,000 Japanese soldiers laid down their arms before the small Soviet detachment. Harbin was taken practically without a fight, which saved the city from destruction and preserved its industrial potential. A similar scenario unfolded in Changchun. The advanced detachment of the 6th Guards Tank Army of the Trans-Baikal Front, having covered over 100 kilometers in a day, burst into the city on the morning of August 18th. The Japanese garrison did not expect the Soviet troops to appear so soon and did not have time to organize a defense. An airborne landing, carried out the day before, captured the imperial palace, where Puyi, the nominal ruler of Manchukuo, was located. Mukden, Shenyang, the largest industrial center in southern Manchuria, was taken as a result of a swift operation by troops of the 1st Far Eastern Front. An advanced detachment under the command of Colonel Artemenko, consisting of a tank brigade and a motorized rifle regiment, made a 60-kilometer dash and entered the city early on the morning of August 21st. Simultaneously, other Soviet units entered the city from several directions. The Japanese garrison, demoralized by news of the emperor's surrender, offered no organized resistance. Individual groups of fanatical officers attempted to organize the defense of industrial facilities or destroy them, but were neutralized by Soviet paratroopers and advanced detachments. A distinctive feature of urban operations in Manchuria was the widespread use of special capture groups. These small but well-trained units had specific tasks to seize bridges, power stations, waterworks, communication hubs, and other important facilities. Operating autonomously, they penetrated the city before the main forces arrived and neutralized Japanese groups preparing objectives for destruction. The tactics of urban warfare employed by Soviet troops had been refined during the war with Germany. The main emphasis was on speed, surprise, and decisive action. Instead of methodical clearing of blocks, raids were used along main arteries to seize key objectives and strongholds of resistance. This allowed for paralyzing defense management and demoralizing the enemy. Thanks to these tactics, most of Manchuria's industrial infrastructure was preserved. The Japanese planned to destroy factories, power stations, bridges, and railway junctions during their retreat, but they did not have time to implement these plans. Soviet paratroopers and capture groups outmaneuvered them, taking control of the most important facilities. Soviet engineering units played a special role in preserving the region's industrial potential. Immediately after the capture of cities, they began demining facilities, many of which the Japanese had managed to mine but could not detonate. Thousands of mines and landmines were diffused at power stations, bridges, dams, and industrial enterprises. August 15, 1945, a day that changed the course of history. Emperor Hirohito, descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, addressed the nation by radio for the first time in Japan's history. His voice, which his subjects had never heard before, sounded unusually quiet and reserved. Behind these dry, diplomatic formulations lay the incredible truth: Japan had capitulated. What compelled the emperor to make this most difficult decision? Historians still debate which factor proved decisive: the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the swift defeat of the Kwantung Army. On the evening of August 14th, a historic meeting took place at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Japan's highest military and civilian leaders discussed the country's critical situation. War Minister General Anami insisted on continuing the war. At that moment, a liaison officer entered the hall and handed him a telegram. Anami's face changed. The telegram contained shocking news. Soviet troops had broken through all defensive lines and were rapidly advancing deep into Manchuria. The Greater Khingan, considered an insurmountable barrier, had been crossed in 3 days. Harbin was under threat of capture. Communication with many units was lost. The Kwantung Army, the pride of the Japanese armed forces, was suffering a crushing defeat. This news had the effect of a bombshell. If there was still hope that the Americans did not have a large stock of atomic bombs, the rapid defeat of the seemingly impregnable Kwantung Army showed that Japan was defenseless in the face of the Soviet offensive. Prime Minister Suzuki addressed the emperor. "Your Majesty, we must accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Continuing the war will lead to the complete destruction of the nation." After a long silence, the emperor uttered the historic phrase, "I have decided to endure the unendurable." But not everyone agreed with the emperor's decision. A group of high-ranking officers led by Major Hatanaka attempted a coup d'état. They planned to seize the imperial palace, destroy the recording of Hirohito's address, and continue the war. The rebellion was suppressed, but it showed how strong the resistance to the idea of surrender was among the Japanese military. Debates about what played a decisive role in Japan's surrender, the atomic bombings or the USSR's entry into the war, continue to this day. American historians traditionally emphasize the significance of the atomic bombs. However, many facts suggest that it was the defeat of the Kwantung Army that was the last straw. Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th. But even after this, the Japanese government continued to discuss the terms of a possible peace, insisting on retaining the imperial system. The decisive meeting of the Supreme War Council took place precisely on August 14th, when the scale of the catastrophe in Manchuria became known. Japan's Foreign Minister Togo later admitted, "The Soviet Union's entry into the war finally put us in a hopeless position and made it impossible to continue the war." American historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, author of the book Racing the Enemy, writes, "The Soviet invasion of Manchuria had a far greater impact on Japan's decision to surrender than the atomic bombings. Indeed, Japan had experienced devastating bombings of its cities before. Tokyo was practically destroyed by incendiary bombs in March 45, killing about 100,000 people, more than in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. But then, there was no talk of surrender. Atomic bombs were a new, terrifying weapon, but for Japan's military leadership, the main question remained, could resistance continue on the mainland? The defeat of the Kwantung Army in a matter of days provided an unambiguous answer to this question. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, and it seemed the war was over. However, in Manchuria, the echo of war continued to resound. Many Japanese units did not lay down their arms, and some commanders refused to acknowledge the order to surrender. For them, the war continued despite the emperor's will. The Kwantung Army, once a formidable force, was now disintegrating into scattered pockets of resistance, each acting at its own discretion. In the mountainous regions of Khingan, in fortified areas along the Soviet-Manchurian border, and in individual cities, Japanese garrisons continued to fight with desperate tenacity. In the Mudanjiang area, units of the Japanese Fifth Army, under the command of General Shimizu, engaged in fierce battles with advancing Soviet troops. When the commander received the order to surrender, he gathered his staff officers and delivered a brief speech. For a samurai, there is no greater disgrace than to surrender to the enemy. After these words, the general committed ritual suicide, seppuku. Dozens of officers followed his example. Similar tragedies unfolded in many Japanese headquarters. Officers, raised in the spirit of Bushido, the code of samurai honor, preferred death to captivity. Colonel Takeda, commander of the 223rd Infantry Regiment, upon receiving news of the surrender, ordered the regimental banner burned and then shot himself. His suicide note contained the words, "I follow the regimental banner. I ask your forgiveness, Your Majesty, for not being able to fulfill my duty to the end." The Soviet command, understanding the complexity of the situation, developed a special tactic for accepting the surrender of Japanese units. Parliamentaries were sent to encircled garrisons with ultimatums, explaining the terms of surrender and guaranteeing the preservation of life for all who laid down their arms. Such delegations often included captured Japanese officers who could confirm the emperor's surrender and convince their comrades of the futility of further resistance. However, these missions were not always successful. There were known cases where Japanese fanatics killed parliamentaries, including their compatriots. For example, in the vicinity of Vaishaki Station, a group of Soviet officers with a white flag was shot by Japanese machine gunners. In the Hylar area, a Japanese garrison of about 5,000 men refused to capitulate and continued fierce resistance until August 19th, when it was completely encircled and destroyed. In the mountains of Lesser Khingan, isolated groups of Japanese soldiers continued to fight until the end of August, unwilling to acknowledge defeat. They set up ambushes on roads, attacked small Soviet units and convoys. Special mobile detachments were created to combat them, scouring the mountainous regions. One of the most dramatic episodes was the surrender of the Kwantung Army headquarters in Changchun, Commander-in-Chief General Yamada Otozo initially refused to admit defeat, stating that a samurai does not surrender. However, after lengthy negotiations with Soviet representatives and under pressure from his subordinates, he finally agreed to sign the Act of Surrender on August 19th. In his last order, Yamada called on all Japanese units to cease resistance and lay down their arms. This order was broadcast by radio and disseminated through leaflets from airplanes, which contributed to the cessation of fighting in many areas. The process of disarming Japanese troops was complex and dangerous. Many soldiers, even when surrendering, tried to keep bladed weapons or grenades for suicide. Soviet troops had to exercise special vigilance when accepting surrendering units. Disarmament was carried out according to a strict protocol. Japanese units lined up in designated areas. Officers surrendered personal weapons separately from soldiers, and then everyone underwent a thorough search. Particular attention was paid to finding hidden weapons and explosives. By August 25th, the main part of the Kwantung Army had laid down its arms. Approximately 540,000 Japanese soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. This was the largest surrender of Japanese troops throughout the war. Prisoners were sent to specially organized camps, where they were provided with food, medical care, and housing. The conditions of detention, although Spartan, complied with international norms. However, in remote areas of Manchuria and on southern Sakhalin, isolated Japanese units continued resistance until early September. The last major hotbed was Shumshu Island in the Kuril Islands, where the Japanese garrison surrendered only on August 23rd after fierce fighting. Symbolically, it was here that the last shots of World War II were fired. The surrender of Japanese troops was accompanied by tragic incidents. Many Japanese officers, unwilling to live with the shame of defeat, committed suicide. According to historians, more than 2,000 officers of the Kwantung Army ended their lives in this way. Some did so demonstratively in the presence of Soviet officers as a final act of protest. Others departed quietly, alone, leaving suicide notes full of remorse to the emperor and their homeland. The Soviet command, striving to minimize losses, showed flexibility in negotiations with Japanese units. In some cases, Japanese officers were allowed to retain personal weapons until the moment of formal surrender, which allowed them to save face before their subordinates. By the end of August, resistance had practically ceased. The Manchurian operation was officially completed. In 11 days, the Red Army defeated a million-strong enemy grouping, advancing up to 800 kilometers deep. This was one of the swiftest and most successful campaigns in the history of wars. The last shots in the Far East resounded in early September. World War II, which claimed tens of millions of lives, finally ended. But the memory of the fanatical resistance and tragic suicides of Japanese officers, for whom surrender was worse than death, forever remained in history as a testament to the special mentality of the Japanese military caste and the price that had to be paid for peace. The Manchurian operation, which became the final chord of World War II, is striking in its scale and results. The figures and facts of this lightning-fast campaign speak for themselves. In just 11 days of active combat, Soviet troops advanced 500 to 800 kilometers deep, liberating an area of over 1,200,000 square kilometers. The speed of the offensive in some directions reached 70 kilometers per day, a figure unprecedented even by World War II standards. This was twice the pace of the American troops' advance in Western Europe and significantly surpassed the speed of the Soviet troops' offensive during the Berlin operation. Such rates were made possible by the masterful use of tank and mechanized formations, which, without getting bogged down in protracted battles, rapidly advanced, cutting off the enemy's retreat routes. During the operation, Soviet troops defeated 31 divisions and 35 brigades of the Japanese Kwantung Army. Over 540,000 Japanese soldiers and officers, including 98 generals, were taken prisoner. This was the largest surrender of Japanese troops throughout the war. Among the prisoners was the commander-in-chief of the Kwantung Army, General Yamada Otozo. The trophies of the Soviet troops included 1,260 tanks, 6,450 artillery pieces, 725 aircraft, and about 2,000 machine guns. A huge number of ammunition, fuel, and food depots were captured. The losses of Soviet troops during the Manchurian operation amounted to 8,299 killed and 22,880 wounded. These figures, though significant in absolute terms, are relatively small for an operation of this scale. For comparison, during the Berlin operation, Soviet troops lost over 100,000 killed. The low level of losses is explained by the high level of preparation for the operation, the element of surprise, and skillful maneuvering. Japanese losses were much more significant. According to various estimates, from 80 to 100,000 killed. Many Japanese officers, following the Bushido Code, preferred suicide to captivity. The liberated territory included Manchuria, North Korea, South Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, regions of immense strategic importance. Large industrial centers, ports, and transport hubs came under USSR control. A comparison of the Manchurian operation with other major operations of World War II shows its unique character. In terms of the pace of the offensive, it surpassed most operations on the Western and Eastern fronts. In terms of the ratio of losses between the sides, it proved to be one of the most successful. If during the Normandy operation, the Allies advanced at a speed of about 10 to 15 kilometers per day, Soviet troops in Manchuria advanced up to 70 kilometers. The German offensive in France in 1940, considered a model of blitzkrieg, developed at a speed of about 30 kilometers per day. The comparison with Japanese offensive operations in the initial period of the war in the Pacific is particularly impressive. In 1941-1942, Japanese troops, advancing in Malaya and the Philippines, moved at a speed of 20 to 30 kilometers per day, which was considered an outstanding achievement. Soviet troops in Manchuria surpassed this figure by more than twofold. In terms of the scale of captured trophies and prisoners, the Manchurian operation also holds a special place. None of the operations in the Pacific Theater resulted in the capture of such a large number of Japanese troops. Even the surrender of Japanese garrisons in the Philippines and Singapore did not reach such a scale. A unique feature of the operation was the overcoming of the Greater Khingan by tank formations, which was considered impassable. This maneuver has no analogues in the history of wars. Tank armies overcame the mountain range with heights up to 2,500 meters in conditions of complete off-road, which contradicted all existing military theories at that time. It is also worth noting the high efficiency of Soviet aviation. During the operation, more than 14,000 combat sorties were made. Soviet pilots destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air, losing only 46 of their own machines. Such a loss ratio, more than 13 to 1, is exceptional even by the standards of the final stage of the war. The Pacific Fleet and the Amur Flotilla also made a significant contribution to the victory. 14 naval landings were carried out, capturing key enemy ports and bases. The fleet ensured a complete blockade of the coast, preventing the Japanese from evacuating troops by sea. The logistical aspect of the operation should be especially noted. To support an offensive of this magnitude, it was necessary to deliver over 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of fuel, and 200,000 tons of food to the combat zone. This task was successfully accomplished, despite the enormous distances and difficult terrain conditions. The Manchurian operation became a model of strategic planning and operational art. Its results exceeded the most optimistic predictions of the Soviet command. Planned as a month-long campaign, it ended in a complete victory in 11 days. This was made possible by precise calculations, the high professionalism of commanders at all levels, and the heroism of Soviet soldiers and officers. The success of the Manchurian operation, which astonished military experts worldwide, was due to a number of key factors that collectively ensured the lightning-fast victory of Soviet troops. A strategic analysis of the campaign reveals several decisive elements that made possible the defeat of the million-strong Kwantung Army in 11 days. The element of surprise was, perhaps, the main trump card of the Soviet command. Despite obvious signs of preparation for an offensive, the Japanese leadership did not believe in the imminent entry of the USSR into the war until the very last moment. Unprecedented measures of camouflage and disinformation allowed the true scale of the concentrated grouping to be concealed. When Soviet troops crossed the border on the night of August 9th, it came as a shock to the Japanese command, paralyzing the Kwantung Army's command and control system during the critical initial hours. The concentration of forces in the directions of the main attacks allowed for decisive superiority in key sectors. Instead of evenly distributing troops along the entire border, the Soviet command created powerful udarniya gruppirovki, strike groups, in selected directions. The strike through the Greater Khingan, where the Japanese did not expect the appearance of large mechanized formations, proved particularly effective. The maneuverability of Soviet troops, their ability to operate in the most difficult terrain conditions, came as an unpleasant surprise to the enemy. Tank and mechanized formations covered distances in a day that, according to Japanese calculations, would have required weeks. Flexibility in command and control, and granting initiative to local commanders, allowed for prompt reactions to changes in the situation and the exploitation of emerging opportunities. The combat experience gained by Soviet troops in battles against Hitlerite Germany played a huge role. By the summer of 1945, the Red Army possessed unsurpassed skill in conducting large-scale offensive operations. Commanders of all levels had gone through the harsh school of war, learned to overcome the most difficult obstacles, and find unconventional solutions in critical situations. The rank and file also possessed the highest combat training and morale. The technical superiority of Soviet troops was overwhelming. T-34 and IS-2 tanks surpassed Japanese models in all parameters. Artillery, aviation, and engineering equipment were on a qualitatively different level. Japan, having focused its main efforts on the war in the Pacific, was unable to provide the Kwantung Army with modern weaponry in sufficient quantities. Miscalculations by the Japanese command also played a role in the catastrophe. The defensive doctrine, based on holding fortified areas along the border, proved untenable in the face of deep flanking maneuvers by Soviet tank formations. The Japanese relied too heavily on natural barriers, mountain ranges, deserts, rivers, without taking into account the increased capabilities of modern military equipment to overcome them. The Kwantung Army's reserve system did not match the scale of the threat. Reserves were too few and located in such a way that they could not react in a timely manner to Soviet breakthroughs. By the time the Japanese command realized the disastrousness of the situation, it was too late. Key communications were cut, and troop control was disrupted. The moral factor also played a significant role. Soviet troops, having just achieved victory over Nazi Germany, were determined to end the war with the final defeat of Japan. Many soldiers and officers remembered the Japanese provocations at Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol, and burned with the desire to settle scores with a long-standing adversary. At the same time, the morale of Japanese troops was undermined by news of defeats in the Pacific and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although Japanese soldiers fought bravely, they no longer believed in the possibility of victory. The coordination of actions of various branches of service reached the highest level during the Manchurian operation. Ground forces, aviation, and the Navy acted as a single mechanism, mutually reinforcing each other. Aviation ensured air superiority and the isolation of combat zones. The Navy landed troops behind enemy lines and blocked the coast. Tank and mechanized formations delivered deep strikes, and rifle units consolidated the achieved success. The Manchurian operation became the pinnacle of Soviet military art, incorporating all the experience of the Great Patriotic War. It demonstrated the ability of Soviet troops to operate successfully in a wide variety of conditions, from deserts to mountain ranges, from taiga forests to urbanized areas. Subsequently, many principles applied during the Manchurian operation were adopted by armies of different countries and entered military art textbooks. Particular attention of military theorists was drawn to the experience of tank formations operating in mountainous terrain and the organization of airborne landings to seize key objectives. The Manchurian operation convincingly proved that in modern warfare there are no insurmountable obstacles for well-trained and equipped troops under the leadership of talented commanders. The Greater Khingan, the Gobi Desert, mighty rivers, and powerful fortified areas. All these obstacles were overcome in record time. This lesson was learned by military strategists worldwide and significantly influenced the development of military thought in the post-war period. The Manchurian operation, which swiftly concluded World War II in the Far East, held truly historical significance, extending far beyond a purely military success. It radically altered the geopolitical landscape of Asia and profoundly impacted the entire post-war world order. The swift defeat of the Kwantung Army in 11 days of August 1945 was not merely the final chord of the bloodiest war in human history, but also a turning point in the destinies of many peoples and states of East Asia. First and foremost, this operation definitively buried Japanese imperial ambitions on the continent. The Kwantung Army, which for decades served as an instrument of Japanese expansion in China and a threat to Soviet Far Eastern borders, ceased to exist as a military force. Japan, having lost its continental stronghold, was forced to forever abandon claims to dominance in Asia. China, ravaged by years of Japanese occupation, received long-awaited liberation. Soviet troops, having defeated the Japanese in Manchuria, created conditions for the revival of Chinese statehood. However, this liberation had ambiguous consequences for China itself. In the liberated areas of Manchuria, the positions of communist forces led by Mao Zedong were strengthened, gaining access to captured Japanese weapons. This significantly altered the balance of power in the burgeoning civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang. Manchuria became a springboard from which communist troops launched their victorious offensive, culminating in the proclamation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The Korean Peninsula, liberated from Japanese colonial rule, was divided at the 38th parallel into Soviet and American occupation zones. This temporary solution soon turned into a permanent border between the communist North and the capitalist South, laying the groundwork for a future bloody conflict. The Soviet Union significantly strengthened its positions in the Far East. The return of southern Sakhalin and the annexation of the Kuril Islands ensured reliable control over strategically important sea passages to the Sea of Okhotsk. Port Arthur once again became a Russian naval base. Soviet influence extended to North Korea and northeast China. For the United States of America, the lightning-fast success of the Soviet offensive in Manchuria came as an unpleasant surprise. American strategists had expected the war with Japan to last at least until the spring of 1946, and that the USSR would not have time to gain significant territorial acquisitions in the Far East. The swift defeat of the Kwantung Army overturned these calculations. The Soviet Union not only fulfilled its Allied obligations, but also significantly expanded its sphere of influence in the region. This increased the suspicion of the American leadership and contributed to the exacerbation of contradictions between erstwhile allies. The Manchurian operation became one of the first episodes of the nascent Cold War. The geopolitical map of East Asia, redrawn as a result of the operation, largely determined the configuration of the confrontation between the two systems in the region for decades to come. The dividing lines drawn in 1945 partially remain to this day, continuing to influence international relations in the Asia-Pacific region. Of particular importance was the influence of the Manchurian operation on the formation of the bipolar world order. The Soviet Union, having demonstrated the ability to conduct strategic operations of enormous scale at the opposite end of Eurasia, affirmed its status as a superpower. The balance of power in the post-war world was finally formalized as a confrontation between two centers of power, the USSR and the USA, each relying on its own system of alliances and satellites. The Manchurian operation had immense military historical significance. It became a model of a brilliantly planned and masterfully executed strategic campaign, incorporating all the experience of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet military art reached its highest expression in it. The principles of organizing deep tank breakthroughs, airborne operations, forcing water obstacles, and overcoming mountain ranges applied during the operation enriched world military science and were adopted by the armies of many countries. Especially valuable was the experience of large mechanized formations operating in extreme natural conditions, from the Gobi Desert to the Khingan mountain ranges. The crossing of the Greater Khingan by the 6th Guards Tank Army entered military art textbooks as a classic example of solving a seemingly impossible combat task. The Manchurian operation demonstrated the decisive role of the factor of surprise and speed in modern warfare. The Japanese command, which based its plans on traditional notions of the pace of an offensive and the possibilities of overcoming natural obstacles, was completely unprepared for the lightning-fast breakthrough of Soviet tank wedges through mountain ranges and deserts considered impassable. This lesson was learned by military theorists around the world and had a significant impact on the development of military thought in the post-war period. For the Soviet Union itself, the victory in Manchuria had enormous moral significance. It symbolically closed the circle of historical justice. The humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1945 was finally nullified. Russia regained its lost territories and restored its status as a great Pacific power. The memory of the Manchurian operation, unfortunately, long remained in the shadow of the grandiose battles on the Soviet-German front. The victory over Japan was perceived as something secondary compared to the victory over Nazi Germany. Only in recent decades have historians and society begun to fully realize the scale and significance of this brilliant military campaign, which became a worthy finale to the most terrible war in human history.